Hi. Okay, we can all stop playing air guitar now. So we are here. Welcome to the September 2022 online meeting of, turn that off, the online meeting of Sydney Skeptics in the Pub. And my name is Tim Mendon. I'm the Executive Officer of Australian Skeptics. And I'm the editor of our magazine, which is here, by the way. Those subscribers should have got this by now, actually. Anyway, that's the magazine. I'm the editor of Australian Skeptics, Executive Officer of Australian Skeptics and editor of the magazine. And I should actually give our thanks and great gratitude to the person who's rapidly working behind the scenes, who's Lara Benham, who's doing a great job on keeping us on the air. Now, before we begin, we would like to acknowledge and pay our respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We would like to pay our respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging. Now, as I mentioned, don't forget the magazine, The Skeptic. You should be subscribing. You've been going now for 42 years, so we sort of know what we're talking about. Now, you can access most of the back issues of the magazine for free. And no one else in the world does that, actually. No skeptic organisation does that. 41 years worth of publications you can download for free. The last 4 issues are kept for the subscribers. So if you want to read this issue, you should subscribe. Even so, those last 4 issues, we actually include a sample issue on the website, so you can get that for free too. So we are pretty generous. Now, a couple of coming events that you need to be aware of. Obviously, the annual National Convention is coming up in Canberra from December 3 to 4. This will be a face-to-face convention. It's the first since 2019. So it'll be your chance to meet up with the new and old skeptics faces, not to mention the speakers themselves. It should be great. Down in the National Capital at the National Library, December 3 to 4. You should get onto the website now, which is skepticon.org.au, to book your tickets straight away. It will be fantastic to actually put bodies to faces in a way, to see people face to face in real life. But speaking of face to face, Next month, the Sydney Skeptics in the pub is back in a pub, an actual pub. On November 6th, which is only next Thursday, we'll return to the Occidental Hotel in York Street to share a few drinks, have a meal, and hear UK science communicator Zion Lights talk on energy myths and probably myth understandings as well. So that'll be a face-to-face in the pub. Now, for those people who are streaming from a distance and who may not make it to the pub, we're also hoping to run a live stream of the event. Now, we have to admit this is going to be a trial run. We hopefully it'll work out well, but it's the first time we've done this, so you'll have to bear with us. But therefore, you can come to the pub, have a beer, chat to real people, have a meal, and meet the speaker, or you can watch it online on our live stream of the event. So we're looking forward to doing that. A bit of a challenge, but we have great hopes for that. So keep your eye on our meetup page for the latest information. I noticed that the announcement of that event is already up there, so you can have a look at that. Click yourself as an attendee and turn up at the pub on the night from 6 o'clock at least at the Occidental Hotel in York Street. So be there or be left out.
That is October, by the way, not November.
Tonight, which is why we're here. Dr. Charlie Lineweaver is an astrobiologist and honorary associate professor at the Australian National University's Research School of Astronomy and Astrophysics and Research School of Earth Science. His research areas include exoplanetology, which is the statistical analysis of exoplanets and their habitability, cosmobiology, using our new knowledge of cosmology to constrain life in the universe, and cancer. And tonight he'll be talking about Darwinian brains searching for objective truths, science, religion, speciesism, and one of my favorites, the planet of the apes. So hopefully we can finally work out if there is really intelligent life on Earth. Charlie says he's happy to take questions during his talk, but you will still have to use the usual Slido link to post your questions. You won't be able to talk live yourself to Charlie, but I will. And you post your questions on the Slido link that will appear in the chat on the right-hand side of the screen, or if you type in !Q, capital Q, !Q, and then you can write in your questions. And hopefully when we go through Charlie's presentation, he can stop and take a few of those, or we'll deal with as many as we can at the end of the event. So, with no further ado, would you please join me in welcoming Charlie Lineweaver. Hi, Charlie.
Hello, Tim. Thank you. Thank you for that lovely introduction.
Charlie, I think you might be on mute.
Well, am I on mute still? Hello, hello.
No, you're all good. It's actually Tim that has got his audio turned off. Right. You're fine.
Okay, good. Well, let me try to share my screen then. I'll share my screen here, press this button here, and then go full screen over here. And I think that, all right. So this is one of my favorite cartoons. And so I thought I'd start out with that. Eat, survive, reproduce, eat, survive, reproduce. And then we have a human being saying, what's it all about? It's interesting because the human being is the one with the big brain asking this question, and he is the only one who doesn't know what it's all about. But tonight I'll be talking about Darwinian brains searching for objective truths, science, religion, speciesism, and the planet of the apes hypothesis. Now, as Tim said, this is my name here. I'm at the Research School of Astronomy and Astrophysics, and I call myself a cosmobiologist. And so I'll be talking about these fairly controversial subjects here today. So I thought whenever I hear a controversial subject from somebody, I'd like to know who they are, who is saying the things. So I thought I'd introduce you to myself. I was brought up as a Unitarian. I know skeptics are always interested in religion and non-religion. So I was brought up as a Unitarian. Here I am as a, 2-year-old or something and a 4-year-old. And then as I grew up, I became an agnostic. And then I guess as in my teenage years, I became a militant agnostic. And I think that means I don't know and you don't know either. And then later on, I guess I became an atheist. And now I call, and not a militant atheist like Dawkins or Hitchens, but an atheist. And now I call myself an animistic atheist. Now I'm throwing around a bunch of words here. So what is an animistic atheist and how does one become one? Well, so my personal journey is I'm a scientist, and so I study Darwin and Einstein. I'm an astrophysicist, so a lot of Einstein, a lot of physics. And studying Darwinism kind of explains how we got here in many profound ways. You could even call me a radical Darwinist because I use Darwinism to explain almost anything, almost everything, including psycho-Darwinism. In other words, trying to understand why we think the things we do based on our Darwinian evolution. So science turned me into an atheist, but then I've traveled a lot. I've been to more than 70 countries. I put little red dots here on the countries that I've been to and bigger red dots on countries where I've spent more than 6 months. So this is the map of my travels around the world, and I'll be explaining why traveling has turned me into an animist. So let's look at what is an animist. Well, here's a map of the surviving hunter and gatherer populations in the world. You can see that there are some here in the Amazon, some Inuits up here, and some Aboriginal interiors here. So the point here is that we all used to be hunters and gatherers before about 10,000 AD. And when anthropologists contact for the first time groups who are hunters and gatherers, they're inevitably animists. They have religious values. They have this. The wind has a spirit. The thunder has a spirit. The moon has a spirit. Their ancestor worships. There are all kinds of spirits everywhere. Let's just that's one simple definition of animism, and that seems to be a universal feature of humanity. And so I wanted to point out, just make a prediction based on this anthropological generalization that has to do with the Andaman Islands here. If you zoom in on that area there, here's the Andaman Islands here, and here's North Sentinel Island. And this is famous for being an island that the Indian government protects. And when people go there, sometimes they get killed by the local population. So they kind of haven't been contacted yet. And so there was a missionary there, I think, who tried to convert these heathens to Christianity a few years ago, and they killed him. And the Indian government's policy is not to prosecute them for killing people because they just want to be left alone. And so the Indian government thinks they have a right to be left alone. The whole point of this is that the prediction is that we don't know much about the religion of the people of the North Sentinel Islands, but the prediction, I think, will be that they are, whatever religion they have will be animism. So here's a pie chart of 2015 worldwide percentage of adherents of religion. So you can see in blue we have Christianity, and Islam is in green. Irreligion here is in gray, and then we have Hinduism, Buddhism, and folk religions. So you might, I guess skeptics are usually atheists, so they would be in this group, atheists or agnostics. And then folk religions I would call animism. So what about earlier, though? What about before 2015? What about from the time period 5 million BC, 5 million years ago, to about 2000 BC? I would say that every human being on the planet had folk religion, or they were animistic. And so what does that mean? That means animism is a default human religion. And in fact, you could think of Christianity and these other religions as animists with a holy book. So from traveling around and comparing religions, I just think that animism is a human universal. And since I'm a human being, then I'm an animist. That's more or less the rationale behind calling myself an animist. Now, this is Stephen Jay Gould, and he wrote an influential paper about 25 years ago called Non-Overlapping Magisteria. And these two non-overlapping magisteria was science and religion. And they don't overlap because science talks about what is, and religion talks about what ought to be. And he described this as how the heavens go and how to go to heaven. And he thinks these are non-overlapping, hence these circles do not overlap. And I said, I don't agree with that at all. A lot of people do and a lot of people don't. So this is a contentious area. And so I wrote a paper called Increasingly Overlapping Magisteria of Science, and you can see it here, published as a chapter in 2008. But I just thought I'd read the first opening paragraph. As explorers, missionaries, and anthropologists of literate tribes came in contact with pre-literate tribes, we found out that every human tribe has religious ideas about gods, the supernatural, and ethics. We can conclude from this that having some kind of religion is a universal part of human nature. However, to be a scientist means depriving ourselves of the traditional inclination to invoke supernatural explanations for natural events. Scientists cannot invoke gods to explain mountains, lightning, stars, volcanoes, rain, birth, death, or any other of the natural events that are part of our lives. But what about the origin of the universe and its laws, the origin of ethics and the purpose of life? Does science have a role to play in explaining these? Or are these phenomena within the exclusive domain of religion? And the answer I give is no, they're not within the exclusive domain. And yes, science does have a role to play. So I think science can answer lots and lots of things. And as a matter of fact, this relates very much to sociobiology. So in 1975, Edward Wilson wrote this textbook, and it's been a very controversial thing, particularly among humanists. But on page 3, he writes, the biologist who is concerned with the questions of physiology and evolutionary history realizes that self-knowledge is constrained and shaped by the emotional control centers in the hypothalamus and limbic system of the brain. These centers flood our consciousness with all the emotions, hate, love, guilt, fear, and others that are consulted by ethical philosophers who wish to intuit the standards of good and evil. What, we are then compelled to ask, made the hypothalamus and limbic system? They evolved by natural selection. That simple biological statement must be pursued to explain ethics. So I guess I would call myself a sociobiologist since I would agree with this statement. But a lot of people think that using a rational brain, you can arrive at your own form of ethics. But I think humans are largely irrational. And that's why I subscribe to this idea of having your emotions coming out of your brain and therefore having been selected for over long periods of time. So here's a picture of Edwin Wilson. Here's this book. And he wrote, the scientific method has been consistently better than religious beliefs in explaining the origin and meaning of humanity. Colorful they are and comforting to the minds of believers, but each contradicts all the others. And when tested in the real world, they have so far proved wrong, always wrong. So this is like science is better than religion when it comes to testing facts about the universe. And Richard Dawkins kind of supports that idea when he says, whatever may be the innermost feelings of individual scientists, science itself works by rigorous adherence to objective values. There is objective truth out there, and it is our business to find it. Now, I, as a physicist and astrophysicist, I'm very, I guess I would say, susceptible to this view, saying, oh, there is an objective truth and we're out to find it. But on the other hand, my dad was a high school biology teacher, and so I have a lot of respect for Darwinism, in particular, Darwinian evolution's influence on our brains. So there's a Darwinian dilemma, and one way to describe it is it's the frustratingly frequent incompatibility between an objective scientific search for truth using our human brains that have been selected to harbor useful fictions and myths that we have depended on for survival, some of which we still need to survive. But which ones? Another way to sum that is you can't have a view on anything except from a viewpoint. And the pretense that scientists can have objective viewpoints is undermined by the fact that we are biologically evolved critters, and that is our viewpoint, and we can't get away from that. We can pretend to, but I think it needs a more subtle approach than just pretending that you're an objective observer. So, for example, in 2019, in an article called Cosmic Perspectives and the Myths We Need to Survive, I wrote this: like all organs, our brains have evolved to help us survive. They have evolved to see the world in useful ways that promoted the survival of our ancestors. This presents scientists with a dilemma. We are looking for the truth, but the Darwinian truth about evolution suggests that when useful survival-promoting fictions conflict with the truth, we can prefer the useful fictions. How can we scientists insist on the truth when the same brains that are searching for truth sometimes prefer useful fictions for perfectly legitimate scientific reasons that Darwin helped us understand. So now the term myths we need to survive has been popularized by Yuval Noah Harari, and I can recommend his book Sapiens. And this is a YouTube video that you can have a look at. It's an hour and a half long, but he talks about the myths we need to survive. And essentially, he's representing this view. He's not so married as a physicist is to the concept of objective truth, but he is concentrating and focusing on things like nationalism and money. These are myths we need to survive, and for example, and religion, for example. So also in searching through the YouTube for skeptical versions of the same idea, there's this guy, Stuart Vyse. He wrote a book called The Uses of Delusion. And here's a Michael Shermer interviewing him on one YouTube video. And here's another YouTube video. I think it's from the Center for Inquiry. He said, this is called, the book is called The Uses of Delusion, Why It's Not Always Rational to Be Rational. And he said he was motivated to write this because I kept coming up against things that were not rational, but still helpful. So here's a simple way, there's a Venn diagram to try to understand this conflict between what is truthful and what is useful, between validity and utility. And the reason this word Darwinian is here is because when you think about Darwinian evolution, it has nothing to do with validity. It has all to do with utility. Is it useful? Does it help its owner survive? If you have a brain and you think something, if it's useful, then it helps you survive. That's more or less the definition of useful or utility here. But in science, we use the word truth and we throw around the word validity. Is it true or not? So Darwinism lives only right here, and often there is an overlap. Some truths are very, very useful. That's a lot of technology, for example, the technology that we're using right now to do this talk. But there are other very useful untruths. And but I should say that the whole concept of utility and usefulness is really context dependent. So I'm going to put a bunch of squiggly lines. Matter of fact, there's squiggly lines about what is useful because that changes with time. And for example, I just admitted to being an atheist. If I had said that 1,000 years ago, it wouldn't have been very useful because I might have been killed. But now I'm allowed to say that. And so this barrier, this border between what is useful and what is true is something that's kind of fluid, ambiguous. But there are lots and lots of interesting features of our lives that are right here. And we have to decide whether it is true and useful, or whether it's untrue and useful, and we don't care whether it's untrue or not. So, for example, xenophobia, groupism, tribalism, racism. In some sense, humans have racism. I think it's a human universal to think that your group is better than another group. That's what I call groupism. That's why we're afraid of foreigners, for example, and why tribalism is such a nemesis of humans all over the planet, because we've grown up over the past 5 million years. Our psyche has evolved to live in groups and tribes, and then we look at the other tribes as enemies that can kill us. And so genocide, I think, has been with us a long time. So has racism, slavery, cannibalism. And not only that, but I think speciesism is a form of groupism. We think our species is better than other species. And then there are things like free will and soul, or mammalism. We think that mammals are better. A good example of this is when you see animal rights posters, you will almost inevitably see a mammal. Now, mammals are a tiny, tiny fraction of all life on Earth, but that's what we call animals. There are more invertebrate animals than there are vertebrate animals. And yet the posters are always concerned about mammals, and we're a mammal. And so that's why we're preferring our group, and we think our group is more valuable. So the existence of gods and religion and morality are all here. For example, I don't believe in God, but for many people, it's a useful, I would call it an untruth. And so that has been selected for again and again. In animism, all these supernatural beliefs and superstitions are over here, but they're useful. And so they hang around. And so I call myself an animistic atheist because I think my sense of self and free will. I can choose this. I think that is all over here as a useful untruth. I don't think there's anything resembling free will, for example. So here's an example of tribalism. Here is like Italy a long time ago, when it'd be divided into these little tribes. And here is like a corner of Victoria. And these are pre-contact tribes, Aborigine tribes. And here's a battle between two tribes in the highlands of New Guinea. So tribalism is with us and has been for a long time. So it's no accident that we have a very tribalistic racism inside of us that we have to fight with and are grappling with. And we should be grappling with it. And but what is useful, as the world gets smaller, tribalism, we need bigger tribes, and that's what we call nations. But now we have a problem with nationalism. And then we say, well, to solve nationalism, let's solve it with speciesism. But speciesism is something that values humans, but not other species. And so we get in trouble with the ecologists. So here's Paul Kurtz. And the reason why I'm bringing him up is because he was a founder. He's called the father of secular humanism. He founded the Center for Inquiry, for example. And the categorical imperative of secular humanism is genuine concern for the well-being of other humans. As soon as I see that, I say, well, what about chimpanzees? What about the other creatures all over the world? And this is becoming an increasingly important, almost an urgent thing, because if we only want to talk about the well-being of other humans, we're just going to overpopulate the world. We're going to take over all of the land, use it to produce our foods, and then many other species will go extinct, and that's what's happening now. Anyway, he's a humanist, and I started listening to the podcast of Point of Inquiry, it's called, and I guess I got turned off because of its speciesism. Now, here's another form of speciesism. Here you are here, and in this biological tree, this phylogenetic tree of all life, we are here. So we are a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of the variety of life on Earth. And if we keep on being human-centric, we're going to inadvertently kill and destroy many, many other species that we rely on for ecological well-being. So here's another form of speciesism. One of my favorite films is 2001. And what happens, there's this magical obelisk, and when our ancestors touch this obelisk, they throw the bone up in the air, and they become technological, and they make spaceships. So this, I think, is a form of human exceptionalism that I think is crazy, that prevents us from realizing how deeply embedded we are in the biosphere, and we're part of it, and we're not the only species that has touched an obelisk. It's crazy. Anyway, it's a good film. All right. So there's this other issue about free will or agency. I think now I've accused skeptics of being skeptical about all the gods outside there, traditional gods, but not the God that we often think is inside of our head, that we think is responsible for our free will or agency. So you can read this cartoon here. Do you think the chemistry of the brain controls what people do? Of course. Then how can we blame people for their actions? Because people have free will to do as they choose. Are you saying that free will is not part of the brain? Of course it is, but it's the part of the brain that's out there just being kind of free. So you're saying that free will, part of the brain, is exempt from the natural laws of physics? Obviously, otherwise we couldn't blame people for doing. Anyway, do you think the free will part of the brain is attached, or does it just float nearby? Just shut up. So this is a traditional problem between the Cartesian duality between mind and body. And so we pretend that our mind is free and gives us agency, and we often ignore the fact that lots of other things have brains too. So I don't know. I've been pushing back on the idea that there's a homunculus in your brain that controls what you're thinking. It is just meat, as you can see in this picture here of a brain being cut up. So then I guess the last thing I wanted to talk about is, are we alone? So I'm a cosmobiologist, and so I've studied galaxies and stars and planets, particularly planets. And increasingly over the past, you know what, maybe before I talk about this, Tim, are there any questions that anybody has about this series of tribalisms and skepticisms and animistic atheisms that I've just described? I know it's animism is a term that most people, I guess, I assume that my audience are mostly atheist or agnostic, and that calling myself an animistic atheist is a little bit of a foreign thing. But I did try to convey how it is, or why I think animism is a useful description for all human beings, because it is a human universal. And the version of animism that we atheists have is the little God we put inside of our head that some people call a soul, other people call free will, other people call agency. Agency is a word you will see again and again and again in the philosophical literature. It also is something called the hard problem, where consciousness is seen as something that's non-physical and therefore difficult to explain. So, Tim, I can't hear any. I'll wait for.
If you can hear me.
I can hear you now.
Good. Okay. There are a few questions, especially on free will. I think you've hit a nerve with that one, actually. One was, I think it's more a comment actually than a question, saying that free will is not an issue for 99.99% of human experience. In other words, almost like saying that it's an automatic reaction rather than any free will. I presume that someone can write in a note on that, that free will is not required for most experience. But the other one is, how can we expect most people to reject free will? How do you sort of say that free will is not active in their lives?
Well, that's pretty much the point of my talk, that I don't expect people to reject it. That's why it's kind of like you feel it, and therefore you know it's there. On the other hand, a lot of people talk to God and they feel God's presence. And I guess my view is that you have to admit that your brain is doing all kinds of things that you don't know what's going on in there, but it has been selected to be an animist. It's selected to believe in spirits. And I suspect also it's been selected to believe in its own free will. Somehow that's been adaptive. Now, as a rationalist, I say, well, that's crazy. That doesn't exist. But then as an animist, I say, well, yes, it is. It does exist. So I guess I'm trying to say that you contain multitudes, and I'm not trying to get rid of the notion of free will on an emotional level. But I just want to point out that it's there, and it's probably a big untruth that if you're going to be purely rational, that said, get the heck out of here, like an atheist would say about a God. But you can't have, when you have atheists going around telling people who believe in God that God doesn't exist, it's just a big free-for-all, because no amount of factual information seems to convince people. And so it's based on the irrational part of your brain, which rationalists have to admit is there, because as a rationalist, you know that Darwinian evolution is responsible for that brain, and that brain is what you're using to analyze things. So I'm not sure if that's clear.
Yeah, there's a thing from my point of view. My background is actually humanities, especially in literature. And in literature, fallibility and irrationality is part of the course. You almost expect people to be human, after all, and humanity implies that they're not rational. But earlier you spoke about rational to be irrational. Are there different character types that are subject to cognitive dissonance? There are people who can see one bit of evidence and then ignore it because they have a preference to be something else.
Well, well, Kahneman has written a book about thinking slow, and I mean, he's somebody who's, I guess, defended the view that we are mostly irrational, and our rational brain is some very tiny fraction of our conscious brain, but the brain is doing all kinds of things that we don't know about, and that's what Edward O. Wilson is talking about when he talks about the limbic system and the hypothalamus. These are the sources of emotion. So I guess, again, the conflict is between a search for truth versus the search for truth with a brain that has been selected not for truth, but for usefulness. That is the dilemma that I think we have to live with. That doesn't mean the truth is better than the non-truth. It means that to have a view, you have to have a viewpoint. You have to have a view, you have to have a viewpoint. That viewpoint has to have evolved. The fact that it has evolved means it's been selected to be useful, not truthful. And as a Darwinian scientist who's rational, you have to admit that that's the case. That's more or less the argument.
Which brings you down to a sort of imperial. Sorry, that's not the word.
Empiric.
Empiric. Thank you. Yes, sort of non-empiric sciences, if you like. If you're dealing with irrationality, where you can't measure things. Someone's asked here about how do you feel about the field of sociology that deals with human behavior.
Well, no, well, Durkheim is somebody who is kind of like the father of sociology, and there are two people, one named Jonathan Haidt and another named David Sloan Wilson, who have a more, let's call it a more sympathetic view towards religion, because they say religion is something that people have because it has been useful in the past. If you're a more militant atheist like Dawkins or maybe Hitchens, you would say, no, religion poisons everything, it's no good, let's get rid of it. Well, it is true that as a culture, culture is changing, and we do value as a scientist. I mean, you could say that science, the definition of science is you are not allowed to invoke supernatural gods to explain anything. You have to have natural explanations for them. And so that I'm very sympathetic to that because I am a scientist. On the other hand, I don't think you can just poo-poo all of the power that irrationality has over people, because as a scientist, you know that those brains have been selected for utility, not validity. So you have to accept both of these, particularly if you're a really, really, really rational. You have to say Darwinian is an explanation for these things, but that means utility has been selected for, not validity, and therefore you have things like gods and supernatural and explanations that you have to live with. And that's why I call myself an animistic atheist. I have these animisms inside of me. I can't get rid of them. But on the other hand, when I'm being a pure atheist, I say I'm irrational. But then I come to Darwinism. My rationalism leads me to Darwinian evolution. My Darwinian evolution leads me to say, hey, this is all usefulness has been selected for. And that leads to gods, supernatural, all kinds of things. But the boundary between them is changing. As we find out more about the universe, we don't need the old supernatural explanations are now no longer valid. And so we can replace them. And I think that's what's happening slowly, but not all the time. And I see that skeptics who are proud of their rationality often put a god inside their head and say, hey, I have free will. Not all. I guess I'm not sure how much your audience believes in their own free will, but I would refer to that as a little god that's inside your head.
So the rational part of the skeptic has to appreciate that the irrational is a perfectly valid form of behavior.
I wouldn't say perfectly valid. I would just say necessarily there. And knowing it's necessarily there, knowing how it got to be there, why it is adaptive, can help us undermine it in the places where it's useful to undermine it. So in other words, the boundary between usefulness changes as we get more scientific, I think.
Okay. Are there any more? I mean, are you going to continue? Are we alone the end of your presentation, or do you have more?
No. I have about another 10 minutes or so.
Okay. Well, we have some more questions, but we might leave them to the end. Okay.
Okay. All right. So I'm a cosmobiologist. So I got my PhD at Berkeley doing cosmology. We found the microwave background fluctuations, but because my dad was a high school biologist, I sometimes say that I know more biology than any cosmologist and more cosmology than any biologist. So I call myself a cosmobiologist. So many people are interested in this question, are we alone? And I've put together a MOOC, a massive open online course about this. And if you are interested in hearing more about this, you can go to the website arewealone.us. Anyway, so let's talk about, are we alone? Now, one way to ask this question, first of all, when you say, are we alone, who is we? And when I do a survey of people around the world, half the people say, we humans, are we humans alone? And the other people say, are we the life forms on Earth alone? Now, if you think that the we is we humans, then I think the answer is easy. We are not alone because we're not alone on Earth. If we're not alone on Earth, we have all kinds of animals around us. They're all related to us. We are not alone on Earth. Therefore, we're not alone in the universe. But if you then say, well, wait a minute, okay, let's forget about we humans. Let's talk about we, the life forms on Earth. Are we alone? And there, it's a more difficult question. But many people are interested, they're not interested in finding bacteria on Mars. They're more interested in finding technological aliens, alien civilizations. That's one of the main features of Hollywood. It's also something that many people are interested in. So, excuse me. So we can ask the question, is human-like intelligence a convergent feature of evolution? Is natural selection such that it will produce human-like intelligence when given lots of time. Biologists usually answer no to this question. They think human-like intelligence is not a convergent feature of evolution, and therefore we should not expect intelligent alien civilizations. Physicists in Hollywood usually say, yes, it is, and that's why they produce things like this, or things like that, or things like this. So there's a dichotomy. Now, this dichotomy will stay alive as long as we have emotions and rationality. But I would suggest that this yes answer is based on the irrational side of our brain. And what we know from science tells us, no, we should not expect technological civilization. So I'll just give you a brief intro to that. I call this the Planet of the Apes hypothesis. Now, the Planet of the Apes movie, here's Charlton Heston, and here are the apes that are on this planet. Charlton Heston is in a spaceship. I guess they're cryogenically preserved for long interstellar travel, and they land somewhere. They don't know where they are. And what's kind of silly is they're not really good scientists, because they land on a planet that has 80% oxygen and 20% oxygen and 80% nitrogen in the atmosphere. It's got a 24-hour day. It's got horses and corn and people speaking English. And here's a trial. Here, the chimpanzees are the scientists, and the gorillas are the military, and the philosophers and the priests are the orangutans. In any case, so Charlton Heston gets caught, and they are unbelievable. This guy can talk. And so they keep him in a cage, kind of like treat him like we treat chimpanzees. And then at the end of the movie, despite the fact that there are horses, that there are mute human beings, and there is water, and as I mentioned, the atmospheric contents, it's not until he sees the half-buried Statue of Liberty that he says, oh, we're on Earth. This is crazy. Damn it all to hell. So that's the non-scientific part of this movie. But there's another part. It's very, very susceptible to people. It's like this. There is a niche called intelligence towards which all, or at least some species, evolve. So here we are, humans. We are at the top of this pyramid. And this is our niche, the intelligence niche. And then down here are apes, dogs, sheep, and vertebrates with half a brain. And down here are bacteria, worms, fungi, and stupid things. So we're at the top of the heap. And we think that this niche exists everywhere, independent. And if we fall off, then presumably the apes will come, and they will fill the intelligence niche. That's more or less the idea of the Planet of the Apes hypothesis, that there is a niche called intelligence that exists independent of species. We occupy it now, and if we kill ourselves in World War III, IV, or V, then other apes will evolve in that direction. The idea is that apes want to become humans. And I would say that the other apes want to become humans. Chimps want to become humans as much as humans want to become chimps. There's a symmetry there that I think we're ignoring. So the Planet of the Apes hypothesis is that there is a human-like intelligence niche. There is selection pressure on other species, including our ancestors, to occupy this niche. In our absence, or on other planets, some species will evolve into that niche, and some of those species will develop technology. Carl Sagan has called the occupants of this niche the functional equivalent of humans. But there's lots of data. I think the only way we have to evaluate this hypothesis is the data we have on Earth. One piece of data is how long did it take us to get such big brains? And here's today, here's 1 million years ago, 2 million years ago, 3 million years ago, and here's our cranial capacity. And we look at the cranial capacity of our ancestors as a function of time, we see that it tripled in size over 3 million years. Let me say that again. Our brain cases tripled in size over 3 million years. So 3 million years, at least on Earth, was the time scale relevant for essentially becoming so special and so intelligent and having technology. Well, let's look at the history of Earth, and I will claim that the history of Earth tells us that there have been many experiments, long duration experiments in evolution that have already taken place that show that big brains and human-like technological intelligence is not a convergent feature of evolution that we should expect. So here are the half a dozen long-duration experiments in vertebrate evolution that have already tested the Planet of the Apes. And that is, here's the present day, the continents, here's where they were 60 million years ago, and here's where they were 120 million years ago. The point is that when you have a bunch of landlocked vertebrates on South America, or Madagascar, or India, or Africa, or Australia, or New Zealand, they are essentially, there are hundreds and hundreds of species on each of these islands. They cannot communicate when they're drifting by themselves. And therefore, while they're separate from other continents, they are individual, independent experiments in evolution that last for 10, 50, or even 100 million years. The point is that nothing like human technological intelligence has evolved during those long time periods on any of these independent experiments. And so that's what I held as the most relevant data showing that the Planet of the Apes hypothesis is really the Planet of the Apes fallacy, and it relies on us thinking that we are the best. It's kind of like speciesism all over again. So my view is that humans are unique, just like every other species. And it makes no sense to concoct an imaginary set of which we are the only terrestrial member, and then suppose that biological evolution elsewhere in the universe evolves toward this set. This concoction is the Planet of the Apes hypothesis. It is testable. Paleoneurology does not support it. In other words, when we look at the evolution of the neurology of other creatures, other vertebrates on all these independent continents, they do not evolve towards having gigantic brains like we have. So humans are unique, just like every other species. So half a dozen multi-million-year experiments in vertebrate evolution are the best data we have to test this idea. They strongly suggest that there are no functionally equivalent humans in the universe. This explains the great silence. This is like, where is everybody? This is a Fermi paradox. And yet I say I support SETI because when we have the technology to cheaply explore new parameter space, we should do it. I think null results are important. Even if you don't find anything, it's good to look. And the universe may be stranger than we can imagine. And maybe I'm wrong about the Planet of the Apes. So that's a brief introduction to the Planet of the Apes. I've written a couple of papers on this, and I can refer you to my website. Just Google Charlie Lineweaver and then click on publications. And then if you scroll down past the articles, you'll see the chapters that I've written about this. All right, so that is the end of my talk, and I'm willing to take more questions.
Thank you, Charlie. That was fantastic. As a fan of Planet of the Apes, but not the Tim Burton one, I should add. That's the bad one in the middle, as were the TV shows. But the first and the last are far more interesting, especially from your perspective. Obviously, in the more recent ones, the apes are developing into being humans and taking over the world. So it's the same sort of paradox that you're talking about. It's very interesting.
Well, I think it just appeals to our vanity and saying, if we ever do something bad, then other critters will evolve into this great niche that we have. And I just think it's based on thinking, oh, I'm the best thing around and everybody wants to be like me. And I just think that's just vanity that has been selected for over time.
Yeah, that's also the Jungle Book fallacy. Actually, I want to be like you.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Okay, there's a few more questions here, and some of them refer back to what we were discussing before about truth and that sort of thing. If I can just go through these quickly. How do you feel about postmodernism? This is in reference to sort of truth, etc., and the ability to look back independently as to what has happened before. I presume that's what the meaning is. It's a very simple question, very straight.
Yeah, I don't think much of postmodernism because it's essentially tried to relativize all scientific knowledge, and I just don't think it works. I think there are truths that there are truths that are useful, and that's what we call science. Postmodernism wants to say, well, everything is somehow subject to relativism. It's, my way, my truth, and your truth. That is something that I don't subscribe to because I'm a scientist and you can do tests and technology works. So I don't think about it much.
Okay. Well, that's sort of someone else was sort of talking about that in a way, that are we not able to curate the environment we are operating in to move towards truth, even with our useful minds? Can we change the way we are into being a truth-oriented people?
Well, that's a point of view that Richard Dawkins has promulgated, and this is one of, about half of what Richard says I really appreciate. No, 80% of what Richard says I agree with completely, and 20% I disagree completely. Now, the assumption of that question is that we somehow have the freedom, we are somehow free from our environment. So repeat the question again, please.
Yeah, I'll just read it out as it is. Are we not able to curate the environment we are operating in to move towards truth?
Right. So when you say, are we not able to curate the environment? I would say, yes, culture does change. For example, we don't have much slavery. We're getting rid of slavery, for example. And but let's consider, for example, changing our genome. Let's suppose that we've identified we do gene sequencing of the smartest people in the whole world, and we say, okay, we're going to make everybody intelligent. So we edit the genes of embryos to make them smart. Now, the question there is, why have we decided to do this, and what have we used to decide to do that? I would say that we are products of our environment. So our environment is what's doing it, not us. As soon as we pretend like, oh, we're doing this, we're ignoring all of the evolutionary history that has made us who we are. And our ability to do anything depends on our ancestors and what they have been selected to do. So that's why when I use the word curate, I would instead of us curating, I would say our history and evolution is curating, rather than us taking credit for it with free will and agency to do it ourselves. That's the focus that I want to throw cold water on.
Okay, there's another question. Do you think there are any valid ways to cross the is-ought gap, OUGHT, like what is, yes, or what should be?
Yes, I wrote that paper that I referred to about the increasingly overlapping magisteria is just that. It talks about that in 10 pages. To give you a simple example, one example was the quote from Edward O. Wilson that I mentioned, and that is, the oughts that we have in our head are based on hate and disgust and love and our morality. And then we can ask the question, well, wait a minute, where does that morality come from? How did that hate, for example, xenophobia or tribalism, where did that come from? These are feelings that we have deep inside of us. And we say you oughtn't do that. You shouldn't marry that person because he's from another group or something. That's an ought. But then you can ask, where did that ought come from? And if you can explain it in evolutionary psychology, then that's a scientific way to understand where the oughts came from. Then you can say, well, is that a good ought or a bad ought based on the science of your understanding of where it came from? In other words, these oughts don't come from a Bible, don't come from your rational brain. They are embedded in humanity because of the selection of people with different attitudes. So just a simple example, suppose there are two tribes. One tribe says, my tribe is the best thing ever, and this is great. The other tribe says, I don't care how important I am. Maybe I'm not so important. Maybe I'm meaningless. Which tribe do you think will do the most to protect itself? And the answer to that is the one that thinks it's great. And so that's why evolution naturally selects for things that think they're important. That's why every living organism has been selected to protect itself. And that's an ought. The ought is protect myself. Now, we can explain how that ought got there by science. And I think the same can be said of all oughts. I know a lot of people, for example, like Sam Harris and maybe Sean Carroll, think that, oh, no, morality, you can think it. You just sit there and be rational about it and then come up with your own morality. I just think that's crazy. I think psycho-Darwinism is something I have a lot of respect for. It's still early days, but I think we can understand where our oughts come from in an evolutionary way, and that will help us evaluate them. And that's how science, I wouldn't say bridges the gap between is and ought. I think there is no gap between is and ought.
Yeah. So that means that sort of morality and ethics are evolved, or
Yeah,
are
yes.
they cultural, or are they sort of more deeper than that?
Oh, I would say both. They're obviously cultural things, but there are, I mean, cultures are different, right? All human cultures are different, but there's a leash that evolutionary psychology has in brains that allows you to think some things in a certain amount of diversity, but not more than that. And so cultures, human culture, if you look at human universals, you can see all kinds of things that we all share. Things like smiling, for example. Uh, and belief in yourself, or you love your children more than you love the neighbor's children or a stranger's children. That's something that just comes out, and it's kind of like language, though. It's not just nature and nurture. It's nature through nurture, I think, as Mark Ridley wrote a book of that title. What do I mean by that? In other words, people have different morality, but that morality is not something that they arrive at by rational thought. It's something that arrives at by what our brains have been selected to believe, but also by our upbringing. It's kind of like a language. Specific languages are not genetic, but some sounds we can make, and some sounds are really, really hard to make, and those are determined by our physiology, which are closer to our genes.
Okay, there's one here which is probably the second last one to ask, actually, and it goes pretty fundamental, actually. What do you think is the root motivation for the belief in the anthropocentric view of intelligence? Why do we believe that? Yeah, that people come first.
That's for me. That's a simple question. That is, we believe we're the best. Speciesism, humanism. We believe we're the best species on Earth. Therefore, we do anything we can. And repeat the question. What do
you think is the root motivation for the belief in the anthropocentric view of intelligence?
Oh, our intelligence is better than every other species' intelligence. That's just.
Do other species have the same thing? Do other species have the same belief? Do you think?
Yes. To the extent that they've been selected to compare. I don't think the idea of comparing your intelligence to other species is not something that is universally useful. I think that if a dog said, "Am I smarter than a cat?" that was not selected for them to think that. I think, but species do tend to kill other species more than they kill themselves. And they kill the strangers more than they kill their close family. So I don't know. I see it all as tribalism and speciesism and in-group, out-groupism, and that is something that is a human universal, deeply embedded. That's the origin of racism, for example. And I think to pretend that to go around and say I'm not a racist is kind of like saying I'm not a human being. Racism is fundamentally embedded in humanity, and that we have to realize that and stop pretending that we can get rid of it by pretending we don't have it. We all have it. The question is it useful today in the culture that we want to have? And that is where you say, no, it's not.
Yeah, because of religion, especially in the concept of special creation, would have the view that we are more important. Well, we are different.
If you study the religions of almost any group, particularly the animistic groups, a very, very common theme is some god, which is very important, created our group. And we are the people, and then the other groups are not people. They can be killed or enslaved or, they're non-humans. And so that's a very common feature of religious values all over the world. And it's something that we all have. That's why it's so easy to dehumanize the enemy. And when there's a war started, that's the first thing we do. We dehumanize the enemy and say, my group is better, you guys stink.
Okay, last one, and I think someone wrote this as a bit of a joke, and it depends on your spelling. First of all, we'll take the spelling here. What's your favorite monkey with a double E on the end? Obviously, it's Peter Talk.
Oh, well, who's the little guy who?
Davy Jones.
Davy Jones. I remember when I was a teenager, I used to try to dance like him or something. So Davy Jones or Michael, the guy named Michael was.
Mike Smith.
Yeah,
sorry, I know these things. Sorry.
Okay, so my favorite one, I think it's important to distinguish between apes and monkeys. Apes do not have tails. We do not have tails. Apes include humans and chimpanzees. There are two species of chimpanzees, bonobos and Panpaniscus and Pan troglodytes. Then there are several species of gorilla, and there are also several species of orangutan. And then there are the gibbons. Those are all the apes that are left on Earth. I think we have eliminated quite a few of our closest relatives. The weird thing about speciesism and human exceptionalism is that we have killed many of the things that were our closest relatives, and then we say, oh, look at how exceptional we are. And we continue to do that. Matter of fact, in about maybe 1,000 years, we will kill all the other apes, and then we will be comparing ourselves to some residual monkey that's not nearly as close to us as our relatives are, the apes. And so we will then say, oh, we're even more exceptional. But that seems like a self-fulfilling prophecy that has very little to do with how exceptional humans are, and more to do with genocide, the specieside.
Yes, here. I'll just ask one question, which I actually got in by phone. Hang on a second, I just lost it. No, because they couldn't get onto the chat. If most intelligences get blocked, then we need a great filter. I'm not quite sure exactly if you could interpret that one. If most intelligences get blocked, then we need a filter.
Yeah, well, this is an idea that Robin Hanson, he's in Maryland, and he came up in 1998. If you Google the Great Filter, you'll come across. It's an supposedly explanation for the lack of aliens in our neighborhood. So here's the Fermi paradox. The Fermi paradox says our galaxy is about 100,000 light years across. If we made a rocket that goes 10% the speed of light, that means that we could go from one end to the other in about 1 million years. Or is it 10 million years? But the galaxy is about 10 billion years old. So that's a factor of 1,000 older. Now, if there were species if intelligence were human-like technological intelligence were a convergent feature, then we would see these intelligent aliens. We would have been visited already. We would see alien spacecraft all over the place. We would have been colonized or killed or something, but we see no evidence for alien civilizations. So the argument is there's some kind of great filter that prevents these civilizations from existing. And the idea that human-like intelligence is not a convergent feature could be interpreted as part of the great filter that is preventing other life forms all over the galaxy from making themselves technological and therefore making themselves able to colonize the rest of the galaxy. We don't see that, therefore they're not there. Why aren't they there? Maybe it's because human-like technological intelligence is not a convergent feature of evolution in any universal way.
Okay, that puts us in our place, I think. And with that, I think, Charlie, we'll sort of call an end to the presentation. Thank you very much for a very inspiring and challenging talk. I appreciate it. I sort of had a few ideas definitely planted in my mind on this, and I'll go back and see if I can talk to other species properly now.
Use both part of your brain there, Tim.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. And please, everybody, join with me in thanking Charlie Lineweaver. Okay. Also, I should add before we go that, yes, as has been pointed out, I have trouble with months. And our next meeting is next week, the 6th of October, not November. So, and that's the one in the pub. So if you're in the neighborhood, please pop into that. And thank you very much for attending. And thank you, Charlie.